She stood before him, confident, unshaken. A week ago, she was just the cleaner. Now, she sat behind the director's desk, looking him in the eye. "You're fired." He never saw it coming. But what led to this moment? That's where the real story begins. The silence in the office was suffocating. A few employees had paused their work, eyes flicking toward the scene before quickly turning away, pretending not to notice. No one spoke. No one intervened. The unspoken rule of the corporate world was clear. Don't get involved. LaToya's jaw tightened, but she kept her posture straight. Her fingers clenched around the cleaning rag in her hand, the smell of disinfectant still sharp in her nostrils. She wasn't asking for special treatment. Just 15 minutes to eat, to rest her aching back before finishing the rest of her shift. But to Gerald, she wasn't even worth that. He was already looking at his phone again, scrolling like this conversation had never happened, like she had never happened. A sharp pulse of anger shot through her, but she forced herself to breathe. She knew how this worked. If she argued, if she pushed back even slightly, he'd escalate. Call her difficult, call security, maybe even have her fired by the end of the day. So she swallowed it down. Again. "Understood," she said, her voice steady, though her chest burned. She turned back, gripping the mop so hard her knuckles ached. The hunger clawing at her stomach was nothing compared to the humiliation twisting inside her. She had worked here for 2 years, never late, never complained. And yet, she was nothing more than an afterthought. Footsteps clicked across the polished floor. Someone passing by. A glance, quickly averted. No one cared. No one ever cared. She scrubbed harder, her muscles tight, her movements stiff. The mop glided over the pristine tile, erasing smudges, dirt, imperfections, everything except the growing resentment curdling in her gut. Gerald chuckled at something on his phone. It took everything in her not to look up. He would forget this moment by the end of the day. To him, this was nothing. A minor inconvenience. To her, it was a reminder of what this company thought of her, of what men like Gerald thought of people like her. Disposable, replaceable, invisible. But he was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. For the rest of her shift, LaToya worked in silence, her movements mechanical, her thoughts a storm she couldn't quiet. The mop glided over the floor, her hands wiped down desks, but she wasn't really there. She was trapped in that moment, hearing Gerald's voice over and over again. "You're just a cleaner. You can eat when your shift is over." Not a person. Not a woman who showed up every day and made sure this office looked spotless. Just a cleaner. Disposable. Her face burned with humiliation. The weight of unspoken words sat heavy in her chest. She had swallowed her pride, just like she always did. Because what else could she do? She needed this job. Rent wasn't going to pay itself. But the worst part? This wasn't the first time. Gerald had dismissed her before, ignoring her good mornings, refusing to acknowledge her presence unless it was to bark orders. But today had been different. Today had been cruel. He wanted to humiliate her. He wanted her to feel small. And he had succeeded. As the final hour of her shift dragged on, LaToya kept her head down, but the anger didn't fade. It simmered beneath the surface, growing stronger with every second. By the time she emptied the last trash bin, it was no longer just anger. It was something sharper. A resolve. She would not let this slide. By the time she stepped out of the building that evening, the Chicago air felt colder than usual, but the chill barely registered. She kept walking, past the honking cars and bright city lights, but her mind was elsewhere. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She had worked too hard to be treated like this. She had done nothing to deserve it. No, This wasn't just about today. This was about every moment she had been overlooked, every time she had been disrespected, every time she had been made to feel less than. And she was done accepting it. Her phone rang. She barely glanced at the screen before answering, still lost in thought. "Latoya, are you available to talk?" The voice on the other end was familiar, an executive she had spoken to weeks ago, one of the few people in the company who had actually treated her like a person. "I have an opportunity for you." Her steps slowed. An opportunity. Her pulse quickened. "Yes, of course," she said, gripping the phone tighter. The next words would change everything.
Gerald strode into the office, radiating his usual arrogance. He walked past desks with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. The murmurs around him barely registered. Rumors of change, whispers of restructuring. None of it mattered. Change never touched people like him. He had built a shield of certainty around himself. He had power, influence. The hierarchy in this office was set in stone, and he sat comfortably above those who didn't matter. People like Latoya. He grabbed a coffee from the break room, ignoring the way employees exchanged nervous glances. A meeting had been called, something about leadership changes, but Gerald barely paid attention. It was all noise. Another corporate shuffle. Another executive with empty promises. He made his way to the conference room, taking his usual seat near the front, legs stretched out in careless ease. The chatter died down as the executive team arrived. The air shifted, an almost electric anticipation. Then, the announcement. "Latoya Harris has been appointed as the new Director of Operations, effective immediately." The words hit like a slap. The room fell silent. Gerald's smirk faded, his grip tightening around his coffee cup. He turned, eyes scanning the room, waiting for someone to correct this absurdity. A joke. It had to be a joke. But then he saw her. Latoya Harris, walking to the front of the room with steady, measured steps. She was no longer in her cleaning uniform. She wore a navy blue suit, perfectly tailored, exuding confidence and control. Her head was held high, shoulders squared. She wasn't the woman scrubbing floors anymore. Gerald's stomach twisted. His gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw something in her expression that unsettled him. Absolute authority. And worse, he saw recognition in her eyes. She remembered everything. The humiliation. The condescension. He could see it now, playing behind her composed exterior, like a reel of past mistakes, each one stacking against him in a silent, damning verdict. His mouth went dry. "This has to be a joke," he muttered, barely loud enough to hear. No one laughed. No one corrected it. Because it wasn't. Latoya met his stunned gaze, and this time it was Gerald who felt small. For the first time, he felt something he had never associated with Latoya Harris. Fear. After the meeting, Gerald stormed into Latoya's new office. "This is insane," he spat. You're a cleaner for God's sake." Latoya leaned back in her chair, calm and composed. "Not anymore. You can't just—" She raised a hand, silencing him. "You had no problem belittling me when I was a cleaner. You thought I was beneath you, but now I have the power to make decisions. And my first decision?" She let a beat of silence pass. "You're fired." His face twisted with rage. "You can't do this." She smiled, genuine, unapologetic. "I just did." Security escorted him out moments later. As Latoya watched him leave, she felt no guilt, no regret, only satisfaction. Justice had finally been served.